It started innocently enough, the way these things often do. Every year, we held a neighborhood barbecue at the end of summer, a backyard gathering of mismatched lawn chairs, faded picnic tables, and makeshift canopies. Nothing fancy. Just a bunch of families coming together for a little food, cheap beer, and enough small talk to remind us that we were technically a community. Emily and I showed up late, as usual. She had spent way too long perfecting her pasta salad, the one everyone looked forward to, and we ended up scrambling out the door. I carried the heavy glass dish over to the table and settled in next to her, our usual team of two. But right away, I could sense something in the air. I don't know why, but I just had this odd feeling like something was slightly off. A few minutes later, Alex, our next-door neighbor, called out to us. He was waving us over with a grin, his wife Sarah by his side. They'd moved in a few years back, and while we didn't see them much beyond the casual wave, they seemed nice enough. Alex worked long hours, always in some crisp suit, and Sarah was the friendly type, usually dropping off cookies at the door around the holidays. But tonight they felt different too. Or maybe I was just imagining it. When we walked over, Alex handed Emily a drink, holding eye contact just a second longer than felt normal. His grin lingered as they exchanged a few words, and I could tell from the way she laughed that she was flattered. It wasn't her usual polite chuckle. This one was genuine, sparkling, the way she used to laugh when we first met. I forced myself to let it go, telling myself it was just harmless fun. But that's the thing about small moments. Sometimes they aren't small at all. As the evening wore on, I noticed Emily and Alex chatting more and more. They stood by the grill, laughing about something that was clearly inside, something only they knew. Their heads leaned a little too close together, voices low, just above a whisper. Sarah stood nearby, but I noticed her glancing at them too, shifting uncomfortably. I wondered if she saw what I was seeing, and if she did, what did that mean? To be fair, I didn't have much reason to worry. Emily and I had been married for a decade by that point, and I trusted her. But as the night continued, I felt like an outsider watching something that wasn't meant for my eyes. It wasn't just the way they talked. It was the way she smiled at him, like he knew something about her that I didn't. A few hours into the party, I excused myself to grab another drink, trying to shake off the nagging discomfort. As I walked away, I heard Alex laugh, a low, rumbling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I looked back, Emily had her hand on his arm, her face bright, her eyes fixed on his. And for the first time in our 10 years of marriage, I felt something ugly, a pang of doubt, the slightest crack in the solid trust we had built together. After we left the barbecue that night, Emily was quiet. Usually, we'd chat about the party, laughing about who said what and how much they drunk. But this time, she barely said a word. I asked her if everything was okay, and she smiled, assuring me she was just tired. She reached for my hand, gave it a squeeze, and leaned her head on my shoulder. But that night, long after she'd drifted off beside me, I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the barbecue. Each look, each laugh, each touch, twisting through my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Alex was just our neighbor, nothing more. Emily was my wife, my partner, the person I trusted more than anyone. And yet something felt different. Something had shifted, barely noticeable, like a whisper you're not sure you heard, but can't quite shake. As I drifted off to sleep, I promised myself I'd let it go. It was nothing, just a strange moment, easily forgotten. Tomorrow, life would go on, and all of this would be nothing but a fleeting memory. But that promise, it would be one I'd break, because that night was just the beginning. And soon, I'd find out that small doubts have a way of growing into things that can unravel everything. A week after the barbecue, Emily started coming home late. It started with 1 or 2 extra hours here and there, which didn't raise my suspicions at first. She'd tell me about a project that needed finishing or a deadline looming over her head, and I'd nod, trying to be supportive. Work was stressful for her, I got that. But after a few nights of waiting up alone, eating leftovers by myself, the excuses began to feel thin. And then there was her phone. Emily had never been one to obsess over her phone. We used to joke about it. Actually, she could barely remember to charge it, often leaving it abandoned on the kitchen counter for hours. But lately, she'd been glued to it. She'd smile at something on the screen, sometimes even laugh under her breath. I'd ask what was so funny, and she'd brush it off, claiming it was a work thing or some random meme she'd found. But I could feel it, this quiet distance growing between us, a wedge I couldn't quite see but knew was there. Then came the night when I noticed something I couldn't ignore. Emily was in the living room, curled up on the couch with her phone in hand, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. I was coming down the stairs and stopped just shy of the landing when I heard her say something soft, something that sounded too much like a whisper. I thought she was talking to herself, maybe reading something aloud. But when I listened closer, I realized she was on the phone, her voice low and intimate, a tone I hadn't heard from her in a long time. She was saying something like, "I'll see you soon and I can't wait." The words were simple, innocent enough on the surface, but there was something in her voice that knotted my stomach. She hadn't noticed me yet, so I lingered for a second, feeling guilty, feeling like an intruder in my own home. But I couldn't help it. I had to know who was on the other end of that call. When she finally hung up, I made my way into the living room, trying to act casual. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though my heart was pounding. Emily looked up, startled, her phone clutched in her hands like it was some precious secret. She paused, eyes darting to the screen, then back to me, and forced a smile. "Just Sarah," she replied. She was asking about book club. I remember blinking, trying to process the answer. Book club? Emily hadn't mentioned anything about joining a book club, but I nodded, pretending to buy it, while my mind raced. She wasn't lying outright. She was too smart for that. No, Emily was the type who'd offer just enough truth to keep you guessing, to make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you were the one being paranoid. But that night, as I lay in bed beside her, listening to her even breaths as she slept, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it was impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, her late nights became more frequent. Each time, she'd have a new excuse, a different reason, but the pattern was the same. She'd leave around 6 or 7 p.m., coming back hours later with the faintest hint of perfume, different from the one she usually wore. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, lingering in the air when she kissed me goodnight. The worst part was, I had no proof, nothing concrete, just a string of small, disjointed moments that painted a picture only I could see. And every time I thought about confronting her, I'd stop myself, clinging to the hope that it was all in my head. But I couldn't ignore it any longer when one night, as she slept, I saw a message pop up on her phone. It was just a quick glance, barely a second, but it was enough to see the name. Alex. My mind froze. The name felt like a slap, bringing back flashes of that barbecue. The lingering smiles, the shared whispers, the laughter they'd tried to hide. It was all there, colliding in my mind with a clarity I didn't want to accept. But as I lay there, staring at that single name on her screen, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was happening, something I wasn't supposed to see. And that was the night I decided I couldn't keep pretending. I needed to know the truth, even if it shattered everything. Because now that I'd opened this door, there was no closing it. This was only the beginning, and deep down, I sensed that my life was about to unravel. The morning after seeing Alex's name flash on Emily's phone, I woke up with a tension I couldn't shake. Every look Emily gave me, every word she said, felt like it had a double meaning, hiding something just out of reach. She left for work like it was any other day, with a smile and a kiss on the cheek, like there was nothing between us except the same love we'd shared for years. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, just waiting for something to push me over. That something came sooner than I expected. It was Sunday, and I'd spent the morning trying to keep myself busy, anything to stop the thoughts from spiraling. I decided to tackle a long overdue project, organizing the garage. There were piles of boxes stacked up from our last move, things we hadn't touched in years. I dug into it, pulling out old photo albums, dusty camping gear, and a few random knickknacks from some forgotten trip. Then, in the corner of a box, I saw something that stopped me cold. It was a black leather glove. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was definitely not mine. I don't wear gloves like that. And it wasn't Emily's style either. She preferred those fuzzy, colorful ones, the kind that barely keep out the cold but look cute. This one was sleek, expensive looking, like something you'd wear with a tailored coat. It didn't belong to either of us. As I stood there, holding the glove, a memory flashed through my mind. Alex, from next door, wearing gloves just like this one when he was unloading his car last winter. I could picture it so clearly. The confident way he handled things, that half smile he always seemed to wear. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it made my stomach twist. My rational mind tried to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe he dropped it by mistake. Maybe it got mixed up somehow, some random fluke. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen the way Emily and Alex had laughed together at the barbecue. I'd seen the messages, the late nights, the phone call she thought I didn't notice. This glove felt like a small, physical proof of something I'd been too afraid to confront. I tossed the glove back in the box, trying to calm myself down, telling myself I was just imagining things. But as I was putting everything back, I heard a knock on the garage door. I turned around to see Alex standing there, looking around like he was searching for something. "Hey man," he said, giving me a friendly nod. "Sorry to bother you, but I think I may have left something here the other night." I stared at him, heart pounding. He was trying to keep his tone light, casual, but I could see the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "What did you leave?" I asked, working hard to keep my voice steady. "A glove," he said, flashing an awkward smile. "Black leather one. You seen it by any chance?" I couldn't help it. I glanced back at the box where I'd tossed it. Alex's eyes followed my gaze, and he shifted on his feet, suddenly looking uneasy. "Mind if I grab it?" he asked, almost too casually. I picked up the glove and handed it to him, fighting the urge to say something, to ask the million questions racing through my mind. Instead, I just stared at him, waiting for him to say something, to explain. But he just took the glove with a nod, muttering a quick thanks before slipping out of the garage and back toward his own house. I stood there, watching him walk away, feeling the tension grow in my chest. The questions in my head were louder than ever, and I knew I was reaching a breaking point. I had hoped that I was wrong, that everything was just a misunderstanding. But with every little sign, every strange moment, I was beginning to see a pattern I didn't want to acknowledge. That glove, it felt like a warning, a small, silent clue, telling me that whatever was going on between Emily and Alex, it wasn't innocent. As I walked back into the house, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. If I wanted answers, I was going to have to go looking for them. Because the way things were going, that single stray glove was just the beginning. And I had a feeling that once I started looking, I wouldn't like what I found. After Alex walked away with his glove, something broke in me. The denial, the half-hearted excuses I'd been clinging to, all of it crumbled, leaving behind only a raw, undeniable need to know the truth. No more brushing things off. No more telling myself I was paranoid. If there was something going on between Emily and Alex, I couldn't sit around waiting for it to explode in my face. I needed answers, even if they destroyed me. That evening, Emily mentioned she'd be staying late at work again. Her voice was light, casual, almost too nonchalant as she kissed me on the cheek and headed out. I watched her walk to her car, the same knot forming in my stomach, and as soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept a safe distance, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I tailed her through the familiar streets. She wasn't heading to the office, of that much I was sure. Her work was downtown, a straight shot into the city, but she was taking side streets, weaving through our neighborhood, turning down roads I knew led away from any office building. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching a stranger behind the wheel instead of the woman I'd built my life with. Finally, she turned into the parking lot of a dimly lit cafe on the edge of town. It was the kind of place you'd barely notice if you weren't looking for it, tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore. I parked a block away, trying to calm my racing heart as I watched her get out of the car, her eyes scanning the lot. She lingered by her door for a moment, then checked her phone. Seconds later, I saw another car pull up, headlights sweeping over the parking lot as it came to a stop just a few spaces away from Emily's. And then he stepped out. Alex, wearing that same damn smirk, like he had no reason in the world to be looking over his shoulder. He walked over to her, and they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding that told me this wasn't the first time they'd met here. I watched as they went inside together, the door closing behind them, cutting off my view. My mind was reeling, torn between storming into the cafe and confronting them, or just sitting there, trying to piece together what I'd just seen. The realization was like a punch in the gut, the full weight of it crashing down on me. This was real. It wasn't just my imagination. Whatever was happening between them, it was right in front of me, undeniable. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself out of the car, my pulse pounding as I walked toward the cafe, careful to stay out of sight. I took a deep breath and peered through one of the windows, hoping I'd be able to see something without being noticed. There they were, tucked away in a booth at the far end of the cafe. They weren't touching, but they didn't need to be. The way they looked at each other said everything. Alex leaned in close, talking in a low voice, his hand resting casually on the table, inching toward hers. And Emily, she was smiling a soft, shy smile I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the kind of smile you gave a friend or a neighbor. It was the kind that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had once belonged to me. They stayed like that, engrossed in each other, oblivious to the world around them, to the fact that I was just a few feet away, watching as my life unraveled in slow motion. I turned away from the window, my head spinning, a sick feeling rising in my chest. I stumbled back to my car and sat there, numb, the realization settling in. There was no more denying it, no more trying to justify the late nights, the secret smiles, the quiet whispers on the phone. Emily was having an affair. And the worst part? She'd chosen him. Alex, the man I'd let into my life, the neighbor I'd thought I could trust. As I sat there, staring at the steering wheel, a part of me wanted to drive straight home, pack up my things, and leave without a word. Another part of me wanted to confront them, to barge in and demand answers, to scream and rage until they had no choice but to face what they'd done. But instead, I stayed there, frozen, realizing that I wasn't ready to face any of it. Not yet. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The door to the truth had been flung open, and now there was no way to close it. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying what I'd seen at the cafe, that undeniable intimacy between Emily and Alex. Her smile haunted me, and so did his casual confidence, the way he acted as though I didn't even exist. As if he hadn't just sat across the table from me at the barbecue weeks earlier, laughing and swapping stories, acting like he was my friend. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, and by morning, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I didn't have a plan, but I didn't need one. The hurt and anger were too strong to ignore. So, that morning, as Emily came down the stairs, freshly showered, her face bright, I took a deep breath and met her in the kitchen. She flashed me a smile, unaware that anything was wrong, and my heart twisted. I couldn't keep it in anymore. "Emily, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely holding steady. She paused, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Sure," she replied, setting down her coffee mug. "What's going on?" I swallowed, the words feeling thick and heavy. "Is there something going on between you and Alex?" For a moment, her face went blank, like she hadn't heard me right. Then I saw something flash across her expression, surprise, maybe even a touch of fear, before she forced a laugh. "Alex? What are you talking about? You think I'm blind?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I saw you last night, Emily. At the cafe. I saw the way you looked at him." Her smile faded, and her expression hardened. She stared at me, mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but the words didn't come. I watched her carefully, waiting for a confession, for any sign of remorse, but she just stood there, tight-lipped. Finally, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Okay," she said, barely meeting my eyes. "Yes, I met up with Alex, but it was just once. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake." I felt a sharp, hollow laugh escape me. "A mistake?" I repeated. "Meeting him at a cafe, hiding it from me, lying about work, was that all a mistake too?" Her face flushed, her eyes shifting away. I didn't want to hurt you. It just happened. My heart sank as she said the words. Just happened. As if this whole thing was some unavoidable accident, something that had simply fallen into her lap. I wanted to yell, to tell her how absurd that was, but I forced myself to keep my voice low. How long has this been going on, Emily? She shook her head, her voice small. It's only been once. It's not what you think. Her denial hit me like a slap. I could tell by the way she avoided my gaze, by the defensive stance she'd taken, that she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. The problem was I wasn't buying it. I'd seen too much, felt too much, to believe this was a one-time slip. You're lying to me, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know why, but you're lying. Her face twisted with something between anger and desperation. I'm not lying, she snapped. You're overreacting. It was a mistake. It's done, and it doesn't mean anything. I felt the room close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. You really expect me to just ignore this? To pretend I didn't see what I saw? Her silence told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't denying the affair. She was only trying to minimize it, hoping I'd accept her story and let it go. She'd chosen to protect herself rather than face the damage she'd done. I took a step back, feeling a strange calm wash over me, like the eye of a storm. I think we need some time apart, Emily, I said quietly, the words surprising even me. Her eyes widened, and she reached out to touch my arm. Wait, don't do this. Please. We can fix this. It was a mistake, and I know I messed up, but don't throw everything away over one mistake. I looked down at her hand, feeling numb, hollowed out. You threw it away, Emily, when you decided that lying to me was easier than telling the truth. She pulled back, her face pale, and for a moment I thought I saw regret, real regret, in her eyes. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back to the way things were. As I walked out of the kitchen, her voice broke through the silence, pleading, desperate. Please, we can fix this, can't we? But I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't know if anything could fix the betrayal I'd felt that night. And, as much as it hurt, part of me wondered if this was the beginning of the end. In the days that followed our confrontation, I thought things might settle down. Maybe the numbness would fade, or maybe Emily would find a way to rebuild some sliver of my trust. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, I became the man with the scarlet letter, the one everyone whispered about. Rumors spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, crackling through fences, seeping into doorways, slipping between half-closed curtains. I could feel it in the glances that lingered a bit too long, in the awkward pauses when I walked by. It seemed like everyone knew, and maybe they did. After all, Alex was the type who made friends easily, who made himself known. Maybe he'd bragged, or maybe people had just noticed something I'd been too blind to see. One morning, as I was taking out the trash, I ran into Karen, a neighbor who'd been kind enough to us when we first moved in. She stood at the edge of her driveway, pretending to check her mailbox, her eyes darting my way. She gave me a tight smile, the kind that told me she was biting back words, something that in any other context she'd probably blurt out. Hey, Karen, I said, forcing a nod. She blinked, surprised I'd spoken to her, then gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. Oh, hiya, good morning. She looked around as if checking to see who else might hear. It's been, a rough few weeks, huh? It felt like she was baiting me, but I didn't bite. Something like that. She hesitated, shuffling her mail as if it suddenly needed rearranging, then lowered her voice. Listen, if you ever need to talk, you know we're here. All of us. This neighborhood's got your back. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. Thanks. Appreciate it. The look in her eyes told me she wanted to say more. To tell me she knew, to let me know she'd heard, that everyone had. But she didn't, and I didn't press her. I didn't want to know how much of my life had been dissected over coffee cups and backyard fences, whispered about like some juicy reality show. But deep down, I knew that's exactly what was happening. It wasn't just Karen either. The stares from other neighbors became more frequent, more pronounced. Even the kids down the street seemed to know something was up, their parents giving them pointed looks when they stared at Emily and me in the driveway. I'd see curtains shift in living room windows when I'd walk out to get the mail, shadows moving behind blinds as I went about my day. The worst, though, was Sarah. I ran into her one afternoon while walking to my car. She was loading groceries into the trunk of her SUV, her movements quick, like she was in a rush. But when she saw me, she stopped, the last grocery bag dangling from her hand, and stared at me. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Hurt, anger, and something darker, maybe even shame. I wanted to say something, anything, to acknowledge the weight hanging between us, but the words stuck in my throat. I had no idea if she knew the full extent of what had happened, but I could tell she'd sensed enough. Finally, she broke the silence. "So, she said, her voice flat. I nodded, feeling like a fool. "Yeah, I know." She looked away, gripping the grocery bag, so hard her knuckles turned white. "I always thought," her voice trailed off, and she laughed bitterly. I don't know what I thought. I wanted to tell her that I didn't know either, that I'd been just as blindsided. But what good would that do? The damage was done. Alex and Emily had turned our lives into a mess neither of us had seen coming. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Everyone thinks they know what's going on. They think it's entertaining. Her eyes met mine, hard, filled with a pain that mirrored my own. But it's not. It's a nightmare. I nodded, because there was nothing else to say. We stood there, both of us trapped in the same betrayal, linked by the same web of lies and deceit. When she finally got into her car and drove off, I felt more alone than ever. My marriage was a wreck, my neighbors watched my every move, and the one person who could truly understand what I was going through was as wounded as I was. I realized then that there was no clean way out of this, no way to escape the wreckage without leaving a trail. As I walked back into the house, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, I wasn't the only one living in the shadow of this betrayal. This wasn't just a private heartbreak. It had become a public wound, a spectacle for everyone to pick apart. And maybe that was the most painful part of all. I'd seen Sarah around since our awkward conversation by her car, but we hadn't spoken since. She was often outside, her shoulders hunched a little lower than usual, her face drawn. She had always been vibrant and quick to smile, but now she moved through the neighborhood like a ghost. I could tell that Alex was staying somewhere else. His car was gone, and no one had seen him in weeks. One Saturday afternoon, as I was coming back from a walk, I spotted her sitting alone on her porch, cradling a mug, her gaze distant. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself walking up her driveway. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I just needed to talk to someone who understood what it felt like to have everything you thought you knew suddenly fall apart. She looked up when she saw me approaching, a faint, tired smile breaking through her blank expression. "Hey," she said, gesturing to the empty chair next to her. "Want to sit?" I nodded and sank into the chair beside her, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over us like an invisible fog. We sat in silence for a while, watching the quiet street, neither of us quite ready to say what was on our minds. Finally, she broke the silence. "It's weird, isn't it? How you think you know someone, only to find out they're practically a stranger." I nodded, feeling a bitter knot form in my chest. "Yeah, you spend years building a life together, trusting them with everything, and then suddenly, none of it feels real." She stared into her mug, swirling the tea around, her gaze unfocused. "I think about it every night," she murmured. "Every little moment. Every time he'd come home late. Every time he'd brush off my questions with some excuse. And now I wonder if it was all just lies." Her words hit close to home. I'd spent countless hours obsessing over every late meeting Emily had ever mentioned, every unexplained text, every subtle change in her routine. The constant loop of what if had become an unbreakable chain in my mind, weighing me down more each day. "Do you ever feel like you're losing yourself in it?" I asked, glancing at her. "Like this whole thing is just swallowing you?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Every single day. It's like I can't tell what's real anymore. Even now, I catch myself wondering what I missed, what I ignored. And the worst part?" She paused, looking up at me, her voice barely above a whisper. I keep asking myself if it's my fault, if I did something to push him away. That was the thought I couldn't shake either. I'd replayed our last few years together over and over, trying to find the moment where things had gone wrong. Had I been too distant? Too wrapped up in work? Had I missed some sign that Emily had been unhappy? A chance to fix whatever was broken before it reached this point? But as I looked at Sarah, the weight of that guilt lifted just a bit. This wasn't about us, was it? This was about them, their choices, their betrayals. Nothing we had done could justify what they'd done to us. It's not your fault, I said, more to reassure myself than anything. They made their choices. We're just dealing with the fallout. She nodded slowly, her face softening with a sadness that made her seem almost fragile. You're right, but knowing that doesn't make it any easier, does it? We sat in silence after that, the weight of our shared heartbreak hanging between us. I felt a strange kind of comfort, knowing she understood the pain and confusion. There was something about having someone who'd lived through the same nightmare that made it all feel a little more bearable. After a long pause, she turned to me. So, what are you going to do now? I took a deep breath, considering her question. I don't know. Part of me wants to walk away from it all. But another part, I hesitated, unsure if I should admit it. Another part of me wants answers. I want to understand why. Sarah nodded, a knowing glint in her eyes. I get it. It's like we can't move on until we know the whole truth, even if the truth destroys us. Her words hung in the air, sharp and bitter, but honest. And in that moment, I realized we were both trapped in the same cycle, caught between wanting to let go and needing closure that might never come. As the sun began to dip behind the houses, casting long shadows across the yard, we stayed there on her porch, two people bound by betrayal, holding on to the last shreds of our old lives. And for the first time, I felt just a little less alone. Whatever came next, whatever truths were waiting, I knew one thing. I wouldn't be facing them in the dark, at least not entirely. After my conversation with Sarah, something shifted in me. I had been living in a fog of anger and hurt, but somehow, talking to her, seeing that she felt as lost as I did, brought a sliver of clarity. If anyone understood the chaos swirling inside me, it was her. And if she could start picking up the pieces, maybe I could too. But healing, as I quickly learned, wasn't as simple as deciding to move forward. Every small reminder, every glance at Emily's empty side of the bed, every idle moment alone in the house, had the power to reopen the wounds. The memories didn't come in soft whispers. They came in waves, crashing down and pulling me back under. It felt like trying to escape quicksand. Every time I thought I was free, the memories dragged me down again. I threw myself into projects I'd neglected, anything to keep my mind from wandering. Our garage, which had always been a chaotic mess of half-finished projects and forgotten tools, became my sanctuary. I cleared it out, organized every inch, and transformed it into something Emily would barely recognize if she walked in. Part of me took a strange comfort in that, in reclaiming something, even if it was just the cluttered corner of my life. Then, as the weeks passed, I started going out more. It felt strange at first, awkward, even, but I forced myself to call up old friends, people I hadn't seen in years. We'd grab a beer, watch a game, or just talk about nothing in particular. These were people who'd known me long before Emily and I met, people who could see the old version of me, hidden beneath the hurt. Slowly, I remembered who I'd been before my life had twisted itself around someone else's. One evening, as I was putting the finishing touches on a project in the garage, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. I hadn't expected to hear from her outside of the occasional wave or nod across our yards, but here it was, a simple message that read, "Coffee?" Without overthinking it, I replied, "Sure, when?" We met at a small cafe a few miles from the neighborhood. The place was quiet, with dim lighting and the faint scent of roasting beans, a welcome escape from the overly familiar streets. Sarah looked different, more relaxed than I'd seen her in weeks, though there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes that I knew well. As we sipped our drinks, she leaned forward, her voice low. "How are you really doing?" The question took me off guard. I was so used to giving people the same rehearsed answers, telling them I was fine or getting by. But with her, it felt pointless to pretend. She was one of the few people who could understand the reality beneath the surface. I'm surviving, I guess, I said, stirring my coffee slowly. Trying to keep busy, keep moving. But sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever stop feeling like this. She nodded, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. It's like you're haunted, right? Even when they're gone, they still linger. It was eerie how perfectly she'd captured it. That haunting feeling, that was exactly it. Emily might be out of my life, but her presence remained, woven into every corner of my mind, even where I didn't want her. I had memories of us tied to everything. The couch where we'd watched 1,000 movies, the kitchen where she'd hum to herself as she cooked, the bed that now felt too big. As if reading my thoughts, Sarah reached out and placed a hand over mine. It gets easier, she said quietly. I mean, it has to, right? Or we'll drive ourselves mad. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, nodding. Yeah, I think we'll get there. Somehow. We talked for hours, sharing stories not just about the betrayal, but about the little things we missed, the quirks and habits that had once felt so ordinary. There was something therapeutic in it, a reminder that I wasn't the only one holding on to fragments of a life that no longer fit. By the time we left, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying moments from the evening. Sarah's laughter, the warmth of her hand over mine, the way we'd connected over something so painful, yet so shared. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the sharp sting of loneliness quite as acutely. There was still a long way to go, but I could feel something shifting inside me, some part of myself starting to come alive again. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe someday it would get easier. A month after that coffee with Sarah, I knew it was time to take the final step. The house was silent, echoing with the memories of a life that no longer felt like mine. I tried, in my own way, to hold on to the last shreds of what Emily and I had built, but each attempt only felt emptier. The truth was, I couldn't heal while still clinging to the remains of us. So, I contacted a lawyer. The meeting was short, practical, lacking the emotional weight I'd expected. The lawyer explained each form, the process, the timelines, but I barely heard him. I sat in his office, numb, feeling like a spectator watching my life get stripped to its bare bones. When he handed me the papers, thick with legal jargon that boiled down to a single fact, my marriage was over. My hand shook, but I signed. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but the reality of it hit me harder than I'd prepared for. In my mind, the divorce was the clean break I needed, a way to set everything right again. But as I held the papers in my hand, I realized that ending a marriage was less like cutting a rope and more like untangling 1,000 tiny threads, each one tied to something I used to love, each one holding a part of me. The next day, I waited until Emily was home from work, the papers in my hand feeling heavier than they had in the lawyer's office. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the familiar clinks of plates and glasses, sounds that had once brought me comfort. I stood in the doorway, waiting for her to look up, unsure if she even noticed I was there. When she finally turned, her eyes landed on the papers, and I saw a flicker of understanding. Her face fell, and a moment later, she straightened, as if bracing herself for a blow she'd been expecting. "Is this really what you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "I don't think there's anything left to save, Emily. Not after everything." She looked away, her eyes glistening. For a second, I thought she might argue, that she might fight to keep us together. But instead, she gave a faint nod, her shoulders sagging as if all the fight had drained from her. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice cracking. For everything." I wanted to ask her why, to demand answers I hadn't dared ask before. Why Alex? Why risk everything we'd built? But as I looked at her, standing there, lost in her own regret, I realized that the answers wouldn't change anything. Knowing wouldn't fill the void she'd left behind. She reached for the papers, her hands trembling as she held them. I never wanted it to end like this," she said, her voice breaking. I thought we'd be together forever." The words felt hollow, too little too late. I knew she meant them, that some part of her was grieving the life we'd shared, but I also knew that grief was different from regret. She was mourning what she'd lost, but I was mourning something she'd killed. There was a gulf between us now, something we could never bridge, no matter how many apologies she offered. She signed the papers slowly, each stroke of the pen like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. When she finished, she handed them back to me, her fingers brushing mine for just a second. I pulled away, unable to bear the touch, the reminder of a closeness that was now just a memory. As I left the house that day, the papers tucked under my arm, I felt a strange sense of release. It wasn't happiness or relief. It was emptier, like I'd let go of something that had once been a part of me. But in its place, there was space, a space that hurt, yes, but one that was finally mine to fill. In the car, I sat for a moment, staring out at the house where I'd lived, where I'd dreamed of a future that now felt like a ghost. I expected to cry, to feel a wave of sadness, but there was only a quiet acceptance. This was the end of one life, a life I'd thought would be my only one. And now, I had no choice but to start again. As I drove away, the weight of the divorce papers beside me, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in months, a fragile hope. The pain was still there, but there was also a strange kind of freedom. My life was no longer bound to the person who had hurt me most. The road ahead was unknown, empty, but for the first time, it felt like it was mine alone. And as I left that house, I felt a flicker of possibility, the faintest beginning of a new chapter, one where, maybe, I could finally start to heal. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I put our house up for sale. There was nothing left for me there, only echoes of a life that felt like someone else's now. The familiar rooms, once filled with laughter and dreams, had become hollow shells, each corner weighed down with memories I no longer wanted to carry. I wanted to leave it all behind, to start fresh somewhere that didn't know my story. Packing up was harder than I expected. I'd spent weeks telling myself that moving would bring closure, that emptying the house would be like unburdening myself. But as I pulled old photos off the walls, boxed up trinkets we'd collected over the years, I felt the weight of those years pressed down on me. Every item I touched felt like a ghost of the life we'd built, a life that had unraveled so completely I could barely remember the love it had once held. On the last day, as I was stacking the final boxes into the car, Sarah came over. She'd been watching me pack up, a quiet presence across the yard, her face a mixture of sadness and understanding. Our shared grief had been its own strange bond, one that made me feel a little less alone. "Leaving, huh?" she asked, her voice soft as she stopped at the edge of the driveway. I nodded, managing a small, tired smile. "Yeah, time to start over." She looked down, her hands fidgeting as if she wasn't sure what to say. Then, without warning, she pulled me into a hug. It was warm and strong, and I felt the tension I'd been holding on to for so long start to melt just a bit. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice catching. "For everything." When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, mirroring my own. "You too," she said, her voice a whisper. "You helped me more than you know." We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us tethered to something we couldn't quite name, a connection born of shared hurt, of an understanding that only came from living through the same kind of heartbreak. I realized then that even as I left, I would carry her with me, a reminder that even in the worst of times, there could be someone who understood. After a final goodbye, I climbed into my car and drove away, watching the house fade in my rearview mirror. I didn't know where I was going yet, only that I needed to be somewhere new, somewhere that didn't hold the weight of old promises. I ended up in a small town a few hours away. It was quiet, surrounded by forests and rivers, with a charm I hadn't realized I needed. I rented a tiny cottage with creaky floors and a sprawling backyard that stretched into open fields. The place was a far cry from the suburban life I'd known, but that was exactly what I needed. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. As the days turned into weeks, I threw myself into making this new place my own. I painted the walls, hung up new pictures, filled the space with things that were mine alone. I started going on hikes, getting to know the quiet trails that wound through the woods. In the mornings, I'd make coffee and sit on the porch, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. One evening, I found myself scrolling through photos on my phone, remnants of the life I'd left behind. The smiles, the vacations, the celebrations, all captured moments of happiness that felt like they belonged to someone else. I looked at them, waiting for the familiar stab of pain, the regret that had once felt endless. But instead, there was a sense of peace, an acceptance that those moments were a part of my past, but not my future. For the first time, I felt ready to let go. A few weeks later, Sarah texted me. She'd just finalized her own divorce and wanted to let me know. She'd sold her house too, moved to a city across the state to be closer to family. We exchanged a few messages, catching up, both of us carefully sidestepping the details of the pain we'd endured. But as we signed off, she sent one last message. "It gets easier, doesn't it?" I stared at the words, a quiet smile forming on my face. She was right. The pain had dulled, softened into something that no longer consumed me. I still felt the scars, but they'd become a part of me, a reminder of everything I'd survived. And as I put my phone down, I felt a renewed sense of strength, a knowledge that the worst was behind me. That night, I sat on my porch, staring up at the stars, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. The life I'd once built had crumbled, but in its place, I'd found something I hadn't expected, myself. A new beginning. And for the first time, I felt truly free.